He is taking me away to abandon me.
You are worthless to me.
It was the dead of night when the husband carried his wife deep into the forest on his back. The wife tried to open her eyes, leaning heavily against his shoulders, but her eyelids kept falling shut. To a husband who had just earned a high seat as a royal councilor, a wife struck by the winter plague was nothing but a burden. Faced with the rumors of a betrothal to a high lord's daughter at the royal court, she believed she was already a dead woman in his eyes. The husband did not speak a single word. Today is the story of that very night. Thank you for gathering around the hearth to hear this old tale. Your presence and open ears give breath to these ancient words. Let us begin the story. Edith was 22 years of age. She had to make her way down to the muddy market square long before the morning mist lifted or the first light of dawn broke. Only by arriving in the bitter dark could she secure a stall that was somewhat shielded from the biting coastal winds. If she arrived late, she was forced to sit at the very edge of the market, in a miserable corner where the stagnant water pooled and the fish buyers rarely ventured. On such wretched days, she often returned to her thatched cottage, having sold not even half her catch. Edith's hands were perpetually damp. Soaked in sea salt and bitter ocean winds, her knuckles were swollen and cracked, and when the harsh winter set in, her skin would bleed. Yet her skill with a gutting knife remained incredibly swift. The way her hands moved to scale the fish, draw out the entrails, and chop the meat into neat portions was considered the finest in the entire market square. Her very bones remembered the labor. She had wed Thomas when she was but 18. Thomas hailed from a fallen noble house, a lineage that had lost its manor estate and wealth, leaving him with nothing but his exceptional skill with quill and parchment, and a lingering sense of quiet pride. Edith's own family had no silver coins to spare, so to the eyes of the village, it was a practical, if humble, match. But in Edith's eyes, it was different. Thomas was a man whose gaze transformed and came alive whenever he read the old parish texts or studied the law. The village elders used to speak of him like a stubborn habit. That man will one day earn a seat at the royal court, they would say. Edith believed those words with all her heart. It was in the spring of their 4th year of marriage that her husband departed for the royal city. He was bound for the great castle to assist a bishop with legal charters. On the morning of his departure, Thomas hoisted his meager linen bundle onto his shoulder and spoke. "I shall return as swiftly as I can. Do not worry and wait for me." Edith smiled and gave a gentle nod. Her heart ached to hold him back, to beg him to stay. But she did not reach out. She believed that the woman who had labored so bitterly to support his studies should not be the one to chain his ankles at the final threshold of his journey. She simply stood at the edge of the dirt road, watching until his retreating figure vanished completely over the crest of the hill. That was the last time she saw her husband's back. For the first 3 months, letters arrived sealed in wax without fail. The royal city is teeming with people. The bishop's courts are chaotic. I lack the hours I need to read my texts. They were brief, hurried words, but for Edith, a single piece of that parchment was enough to sustain her spirit for days of grueling labor. But by the 4th month, the news grew sparse. In the 5th month, not a single letter arrived. The 6th month passed in the exact same silence. Sitting by her cold market stall, Edith found her mind plagued by 1,000 terrible thoughts. Did he fail the bishop's tasks? Has he fallen ill with a fever? Was he trampled by horses or caught in some dreadful accident in the crowded city streets? At night, the image of Thomas collapsed in some unfamiliar rain-soaked alleyway haunted her mind endlessly. Yet, when morning came, she once again hoisted her heavy wooden basket of fish. Survival rested squarely on Edith's shoulders, and if Thomas ever needed to set out on the road again, she had to gather every extra penny and silver coin so she would not have to send him away empty-handed. It was on a bitter winter evening. After returning from her grueling labor, washing her cracked, bleeding hands in a clay basin, Edith found herself smiling alone in the dim light of her cottage. She wondered what her husband would say when he returned, wearing the robes of a high royal councilor. "Your hands have grown so rough," she imagined him saying. Just those words of recognition would be enough, she thought. Fueled by that single warm thought, Edith smiled as she stoked the hearth fire to boil her thin barley soup. The rumors reached the village not long after that. Just as the frost began to thaw and the spring winds softened, Silas arrived in the muddy market square. He was a traveling merchant, a man who wandered from manor to manor, selling wares and peddling gossip with equal enthusiasm. As was the way of his kind, he was loud and boisterous, and the villagers leaned in, far more eager to hear the tales spilling from his mouth than to inspect the goods in his wooden cart. That day, Edith was scraping scales off a fish, letting the idle chatter of the neighboring women wash over her. Then Silas brought up the royal charters. "The man who just solved the royal land dispute is a truly remarkable fellow," Silas declared. "They say even the most powerful noble houses in the royal city are in an absolute uproar over him." At first, it sounded like a tale of a distant stranger. But then, the family name caught in her ears. "Thomas," he said. He even named this very village as the scholar's home. Edith's hands froze. The fish scales clinging to the edge of her iron blade dropped silently to the mud. Silas, thrilled by the captive audience, eagerly continued. As soon as the high bishop named him royal councilor, a proposal of marriage came directly from a high lord of the king's court. Word is they have already exchanged vows of betrothal. It seems a grand church wedding is imminent. The market square erupted into murmurs. Agnes glanced sideways at Edith, then quickly snapped her mouth shut. Another market woman clicked her tongue in mock pity. "You really know nothing of how the world works, do you? When a man rises to power, he forgets his old, wretched home in the blink of an eye." Another woman was far more cruel. A high-born lady wrapped in velvet on one side, and a woman reeking of fish guts on the other. What place does a lowly peasant wife have beside him now? A few muffled snickers followed that remark. Every single word pierced Edith's ears. Edith tried to force a smile. "It cannot be true," she told herself. "My Thomas is not that kind of man." But her throat tightened until it felt stiff as stone. The hand gripping the gutting knife trembled violently. The stench of raw fish suddenly surged up, sickeningly foul, and the muddy ground of the market seemed to sway and ripple before her eyes. Still, she could not weep. The entire village was watching her. Clenching her jaw, Edith began to slice the fish once more. Her hands moved purely by the memory of the labor, but inside, her entire world was collapsing into ruin. That night, Edith did not light a single candle. The room inside the timber cottage was pitch black. She simply sat there, swallowed by the dark. "It isn't true," she whispered to herself over and over. Rumors are always bloated by the time they traveled this far. But it had been half a year since his last letter. Her denials slowly lost their strength. A few days later, a far more cruel rumor reached the village. This time, the gossip flowing from the neighboring parish claimed that the marriage was already sealed in stone. The High Lord had taken the new royal councilor as his son-in-law, securing him within the noble household. Edith returned to her cottage and bundled her meager belongings. She was determined to walk all the way to the royal city to see the truth for herself. Clutching the pennies she had saved from selling fish, the few faded parchment letters from her husband, and a single spare linen gown, she marched to the edge of the village just before dawn. But standing there, blocking the dirt road, was Guy. He declared that the road was sealed by order of the Crown Authority due to the winter plague. No man or woman was permitted to leave the village, and none were permitted to enter. Edith stood frozen in the road for a long time, clutching her bundle to her chest. Then her legs gave out, and she collapsed into the dirt. She could not verify the truth. She could not confront him, and she could not seek him out. Sitting on that blocked path, Edith thought for the very first time that perhaps she truly had been abandoned. From that night onward, Edith lost all desire for food. She continued to sell fish in the market square, for if she did not, she would starve. But the market was no longer a place of labor. It felt like a cruel purgatory. Even when the villagers did not speak directly to her, she could hear their incessant whispering. "Is that the wife of the new royal councilor? What does it matter if she is his wife? She's been cast aside for a high-born lady." It is a pity, yes, but truth be told, a low-born woman never belonged with a noble scholar anyway. Edith spoke less and less. When she returned to her cottage, she delayed lighting the hearth, and even when she set a bowl of thin soup before herself, she would spend hours staring blankly at her ruined hands. She would pull Thomas's letters from their hiding place, only to put them away, then pull them out again. When she looked at his handwriting, he felt like a living, breathing man beside her. But when she remembered the rumors, he felt like a ghost who had already crossed into another world. Then came the day. Upon returning from the market, Edith was preparing her meager meal when she suddenly collapsed to the floor. A terrible chill racked her bones. At first, she thought it was merely a harsh winter fever. She believed a day of rest would cure her. But the next morning, when she pressed her arms against the floorboards to rise, her limbs gave way entirely. Her breath grew shallow, and a violent, rattling cough tore from her chest. It was the plague. The village apothecary had long since fled. There was no monastery nearby to beg for rare medicine. In a village sealed by the plague, no one dared to visit. By the third day, the leftover fish piled in the corner of her room began to emit a putrid, rotting stench. Edith possessed no strength even to drag it outside. She could barely swallow a drop of water. No one knocked on her heavy wooden door. Even if someone were to die in here, no one would know for days, she thought. That night, staring up at the thatched roof, Edith accepted her fate. I am going to die like this. I will die without ever knowing the truth, without ever demanding an answer, suffocating in this wretched unfairness. Hot tears pooled in the corners of her eyes, but she lacked the strength to even let them fall. It was then. Footsteps crunched against the frost outside. They stopped right before her door. The heavy timber door creaked open. It was her husband. Edith tried to open her eyes. The fever severely blurred her vision, but she could instantly recognize the height and the breadth of those shoulders. She could not tell if it was a waking dream or reality. Thomas stepped into the pitch-black room without a single word. In a cottage reeking of rotting fish, he stood over Edith for a brief moment, then silently knelt and lifted her onto his back. Why? Edith barely managed to part her cracked lips, but the word carried no sound. Thomas did not answer. He carried her out the door. The freezing night air violently whipped across Edith's face. His back felt cold, and his strides were hurried. Beneath his boots, dead branches snapped with sharp cracks. He was not taking the main dirt road. He was carrying her deeper and deeper into the dark, untamed forest. Only then did Edith realize the truth. He is taking me away to abandon me. A wife dying of the plague was a burden. And to a husband who had secured his place as a high royal councilor, she was nothing but a shameful stain left on the road to the royal city. If the rumors of his new noble marriage were true, this made perfect sense. Carrying her wordlessly into the deep woods in the dead of night felt exactly like a man trying to dispose of a secret where no one would ever find it. Edith clenched her teeth and fought to keep her eyes open. She wanted to burn the memory of where she was being thrown away into her mind. She wanted to crawl her way back out, even if it tore her flesh. But the burning fever kept dragging her consciousness down into the abyss. Every time Thomas's back swayed, the world slipped further away. "My lord," Edith whispered in a voice barely louder than a breath. There was no answer. She called out to him once more, but the silence remained unbroken. Edith wept silently in her heart. "If you are going to throw me away, just drop me here in the snow," she thought. The winter wind grew vicious. The biting gales slashed at her ears, and the freezing chill seeped into her very bones. Thomas's breathing grew ragged and heavy. She could feel him stumble and slip on the treacherous, icy ground time and time again. Yet he never once stopped. The last thing Edith saw before her eyes finally surrendered was the cold sweat soaking the back of Thomas's neck. Then she fell into darkness. The scent reached her first. It was the smell of medicinal herbs. It was unfamiliar, yet not unpleasant. It settled gently at the tip of her nose, accompanied by the feeling of warm, damp air. Edith slowly opened her eyes. She was staring at an unfamiliar timber ceiling. Lined neatly against one of the wooden walls were clay pots filled with dried roots and apothecary herbs. Soft morning sunlight was filtering through the cracks in the heavy wooden shutters. Her body still felt leaden, but the sensation of her lungs collapsing The suffocating grip of the previous night had vanished. She turned her head slowly to the side, and there she saw Thomas. He was sitting on the floorboards, leaning heavily against the wall, his head bowed in deep exhaustion as he slept. His face was gaunt and hollowed, his clothes wrinkled and stained with dirt. But it was his hands that caught her gaze. Thick, rough calluses covered his knuckles and palms. These were no longer the soft hands of a scholar who only held a quill. They were the battered hands of a man who had swung an axe and wielded a shovel. Edith let her eyes wander slowly around the room. A warm fire was still crackling steadily in the stone hearth. Resting on a small wooden stool beside her was a wooden bowl of hot oat porridge and a clay cup of dark herbal medicine. Stacked neatly in the corner was a massive pile of chopped firewood, and a wooden bucket stood filled to the brim with fresh water. Did he not bring me here to abandon me? Did he not bring me here to let me die? Then why is this room so warm? And why is there food and medicine waiting for me? At that very moment, Thomas opened his eyes. Edith's lips trembled as she spoke. What is all this? Thomas did not answer right away. He rose from his place by the hearth and brought over the clay cup of dark herbal medicine. Gently, he supported Edith's back, helping her sit up, and brought the rim of the cup to her lips. Even as she swallowed the bitter brew, Edith never took her eyes off him. Only when the cup was empty did she ask again, "Did you not come to abandon me?" Thomas remained silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy. "I had no other choice but to let you believe that." From that day on, over the course of a fortnight, Edith slowly returned to life. Every morning before dawn, Thomas was awake, brewing roots and herbs over the fire. He boiled fresh water, stirred the oat porridge, and at night he sat by Edith's side until he fell asleep, leaning against the rough timber wall. He was still a man of few words, but the room itself spoke louder than any words. The heavy wooden beams bore the muddy handprints of a man working alone. The wattle and daub walls were still damp in places, and the thatched roof showed clear signs of being laid in desperate haste. Yet the massive pile of firewood had been chopped and stacked with care, clearly prepared long in advance. Every clay jar of medicine had a piece of parchment tied to it, written in his neat clerk's hand. Among them, several bundles of dried herbs were specifically gathered to treat the deadly winter plague. Everywhere she looked, there were signs of someone who had been working frantically, secretly, and alone for a very long time. As Edith took in these sights one by one, her confusion deepened. The physical proof of his labor shook her heart long before any explanation could. On the 15th day, Edith was finally able to sit up on her own without leaning against the wall. Thomas walked in, carrying a wooden bowl of hot broth, but stopped dead in his tracks when he saw her. He set the bowl down on the stool and sat quietly across from her. After a long silence, Edith spoke first. "You earned the highest seat on the royal council, did you not?" "I did," he replied. "Are you betrothed to another?" Thomas slowly shook his head. "I am not." Edith could not believe it right away. Her eyes wavered with doubt. Thomas let out a long, ragged breath and began to speak, his words coming in fragments. It was true that he had secured a high post at the king's court. It was also true that shortly after, a wealthy nobleman had offered his daughter's hand in marriage, but Thomas had refused. He had refused more than once. However, as the rejection passed through the gossiping mouths of the city, the truth twisted. The village folk heard only what they wanted to hear, and the rumor spread that the betrothal had been sealed. Thomas had tried to send sealed parchments to her, but a bitter noble who wanted the marriage bribed the guards to burn the letters, so his vital words of truth never once reached the village. Edith listened in silence, but that alone was not enough to unravel the heavy knot in her chest. So she asked in a whisper, "Then why did you say nothing to me?" Thomas's stoic face finally crumbled. "Because a corrupt lord intercepted all my letters." Edith's eyes widened. "It was when the plague first began to spread." He knew that once the village was quarantined, no apothecary or healing herbs would be allowed inside. So he spent his days in the royal city, seeking out wise monks and learned physicians, memorizing their remedies, and quietly hoarding rare medicinal roots. He used a royal decree to cross guard lines and bought this abandoned cottage deep in the woods. He paid smugglers, too, knowing that if the day came when Edith could no longer hold on, he would steal her away in the dead of night and bring her here. "I wrote to warn you." Thomas's voice cracked. "I wrote to warn you, but the Lord blocked my words. I was terrified that you would push yourself past your breaking point, suffering alone there in the dark without any of my letters." Edith's lips trembled. A single letter would have been enough. The words barely left her mouth. And then, everything she had kept buried inside her broke loose, all at once. "I thought you had thrown me away." Edith's voice shattered. Standing alone in the muddy market square, with everyone watching and whispering, I thought my life was over. Even on the night I was dying, I thought you were taking me to the woods to discard me. Edith raised her hand, wanting to strike him, wanting to push him away, but she stopped. Her fingertips trembled. Slowly, her hand fell, coming to rest gently on Thomas's shoulder. And then Edith wept. For the first time since they had taken their vows in the cold stone church, she did not muffle her sobs. She did not cover her mouth with the wool blanket. She just cried. She cried for the injustice of it all. She cried because she was alive. And she cried because she had been so utterly alone for so long. Thomas could not lift his head. Only when Edith's weeping began to quiet down did he manage to speak. "Forgive me," he whispered. "I could find no other way." A few days later, Edith grew strong enough to walk to the doorway of the cottage. The scent of damp earth drifted up from the forest path. A gentle breeze rustled through the bare branches of the great oaks. Thomas had to return to the village below. He needed to fetch the belongings he had left behind, gather the last of the medicinal roots, and make preparations for their journey to the royal city. When Edith first heard this, she panicked and grabbed the sleeve of Thomas's tunic. "Do not go," she pleaded. Thomas gently wrapped his large hands around hers. "This time I will return," he said firmly. "I swear it." Those words felt entirely different from the empty promise he had made on that distant spring morning. This time, Edith looked deep into his eyes for a long moment, Then, slowly, she let go of his sleeve. Sometime later, the husband and wife walked down the mountain path together. When Edith had first been carried up this trail, it had felt like a march to the grave. But the journey down was entirely different. Sunlight pierced through the forest canopy, and the winter wind had lost its bitter bite. As they neared the bottom of the slope, Edith paused for a moment. She turned and looked back. Memories flashed before her eyes. The rutted dirt roads she had walked with a heavy fish basket on her back. The cold, muddy corner of the market square. The dark, lonely cottage where she had stoked the hearth fire by herself every night. The endless, agonizing hours spent clutching her husband's old letter just to survive the winter famine. Those years of suffering would never truly disappear from her mind. But now, at the end of all that sorrow, a new path was opening up before her. Thomas turned to look back from a few paces ahead. He was waiting. Edith smiled faintly and began to walk again. Soon after, the two of them traveled to the royal city. Thomas took his rightful place as an honored councilor in the king's court, and for the first time in her life, Edith lived through a winter where her hands did not crack and bleed from the cold. She wore fine linen gowns that held no stench of fish, and she never again had to spend the night awake in a dark, empty room. Even so, in the quiet moments of her life, Edith must have sometimes thought back to that terrible night. The moment the wooden door swung open and she was lifted onto a man's back without a single word. The memory of forcing her heavy eyes to stay open, believing she was being thrown to the wolves, and the miraculous realization that at the end of that desperate, pitch-black forest road, a warm hearth and a healing cup of medicine had been waiting for her all along. There was once a night when surviving was the only thing that mattered. And it was only after enduring that long, dark night that their true life together could finally begin. That brings us to the end of our tale for tonight. Thank you kindly for listening.